I've had a love affair with Watchmen since I first read it. I was 13 years old, and have talked about it sort of incessantly since I've been blessed enough to move into the pop culture sphere. So in between the first and the second seasons of Lost, I was getting asked questions like, "Oh my God, you're doing nonlinear storytelling, and you do flashbacks, and there'll be every episode is a different character." And I would say I learned that all from Watchmen. I mean, just so we're all clear, I stole it from Watchmen, and Watchmen is the greatest piece of popular culture ever created. So word sort of got out that I was a huge fan of this thing because I was talking about it incessantly. And so when Zack Snyder made his movie, I got pulled into one of these early screenings where Billy Crudup is covered in all sorts of like ping pong balls and mocaps, as sort of like the Watchmen literate. And so over time, basically, I think probably the first time that it happened was around 2011. I had an overall deal with Warner Brothers, and someone over there approached me and said, "Hey, would you want to do Watchmen as a television show?" And my feeling at that point was Zach had just made the movie. The Watchmen is considered unadaptable and unfilmable. I was sort of like, Alan Moore doesn't want anybody to do it. Pass. Like, it shouldn't exist. And then a couple of years later, again from Warner Brothers, and obviously they have all this DC IP, sort of came back and said, hey, what about Watchmen? Like, you said no a couple years ago. Have you thought any more about it? And I said, I have, and still no. And then as The Leftovers was ending, this time Warner Brothers, sort of with HBO, they've been under the same corporate umbrella for quite some time, but they'd obviously been talking to one another now. As The Leftovers was ending, I again sort of fielded the inquiry of, like, okay, are you sure you don't want to do anything with Watchmen? And now the sort of parentheses was, we're gonna move on. Like, we're gonna start asking other people to do this. And at that point, I started realizing this thing is gonna happen whether I do it or not. And I know that it's a moral justification to say, well, I'm a vegan, but that steak is already there. The animal's already dead. So if I don't eat it, it's just gonna rot. That's BS. Like, but I started to feel the professional jealousy of what was it going to be like for me to see someone else's Watchmen, knowing that I had a shot at it and I didn't take it. And then also I started to feel like I had the beginnings of what the ideas might be to go into this Watchmen. And so the third time that they asked me, I said, let me go give it a think. And then kind of here we are 2 years later, and it exists. I think that the idea of what happens when masking sort of spreads to policing, that was a big part of it. The idea of how we feel in America about policing right now, and the institution of the law and authority all felt very timely, but it also felt like a very natural progression from the central ideas of the original Watchmen, which were, who watches the Watchmen? One of the questions that it was asking is, what is the line between the law and vigilantism? When is it okay to go above and beyond the law? And so I felt like that was a central tenet of Watchmen. And now the 2019 that I was living in was constantly questioning and doubting the intention and ability of police, and more importantly, the government that was responsible for policing the police. And so all of those ideas felt just as relevant now as they did in the mid 80s, but it felt like there was an evolution to be had there. And so that central idea, thematically really took hold. And then the other was that just sort of all around me was the feeling of like there was a reckoning happening in the country as it related to race. When I read The Case for Reparations, which was an essay of his in The Atlantic, that was the sermon that I heard that suddenly changed my entire perspective on the way that I saw the world. And in that essay, he mentioned Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, and I felt ashamed and embarrassed that I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. I had somehow considered myself an educated person who was somewhat of a history buff, interested in the history of race in the past century and beyond, and yet I didn't know what Black Wall Street was. So I bought a book called The Burning that tells the detailed story of that, and I was reading that book at the time that this Watchmen invitation happened. And so all of those things were starting to swirl around in my brain, and they started to feel like they might combine into a television experience. Coming into Watchmen, I feel what I learned is that not to get locked in on what I feel the very specific, there's only one frequency we can tune into here. There's actually a lot more bandwidth, and more importantly, to listen more. And I feel like that's really hard. It's easy for me to say like, I listened to the other writers. That's always my intention, but it's hard when someone else is talking to say to your own brain, shut up. You're just waiting to say the next thing that you want to say. You're not really listening. You're not really creating a space for their idea to flourish. You just want their idea to support whatever your next idea is. And I went through that process on The Leftovers, and I think as a result, the second and third season of The Leftovers became this incredible thing that didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like ours. And I really feel that way about Watchmen too. That happened very quickly, but it stopped being mine pretty quickly, started becoming ours, because we obviously all had different relationships with the source material, and we're finding the new thing together. So we actually put the writer's room together, about a dozen writers, before the pilot was written, just to do the world building, because we knew that everything in the original Watchmen was canon, so we were kind of covered through 86. Late 85, and that we needed to build a new history between December of 85 and basically September of 2019, which is the front story, the present time for our Watchmen, in addition to carving out spaces in the pre-existing history of the previous Watchmen, because our story actually starts in 1921 in Oklahoma. And so we had to do a lot of work over the course of that time period. And in that time period, we also broke the pilot episode. And then I went off and wrote that. We hiatused the writer's room. We shot the pilot, and then HBO watched the pilot and said, okay, we're gonna go ahead and order the series. Because one of the things that I think makes the original Watchmen endure is that it was a complete story, beginning, middle, and end over the course of those 12 issues. And when I finished reading the 12th issue, of course I wanted more, because I loved it so much, but I also felt like a sense of completedness, and I want the audience to have the same sense watching these 9 episodes. Getting there, getting to the destination, getting to what the last episode's going to be. A big part of the original Watchmen, and the way that I like to tell stories and watch stories, is what's the pace at which you answer questions and resolve mysteries. And again, that's an imperfect science. I've learned over time that it's not an exact science. But so we knew the answers to a lot of the questions that the show is asking, but are we going to answer them in episode 6? Are we going to answer them in episode 8? Maybe we do this one in episode 7, but there's some stuff that could only happen in the finale. So I think that we knew more about how the season was going to end than we did about some of the things that were happening in the range of episodes, sort of like 5 through 8. The original plan was to do 10. And as we started plotting out the episodes, it started to feel like we were getting into that territory where one of them was going to be filler. Like, it was so clear to me that the pacing wanted to be very explosive in the pilot. We wanted to stop and kind of recalibrate in episodes 2 and 3, and then episodes 4, 5, 6. Very specific ramp into like kind of a white knuckle 7, 8, 9. But as I started to feel like when the 10th episode was the finale, and I started looking at the roadmap that we were going to take to get there, I was like, it feels like we're kind of driving 40 miles an hour here in these mid-range of episodes. What if we just pull this one out and we do 9? Then everything really started to click. So we ended up with this. I'm sort of really curious about this idea of like how many episodes is a season of television now? What's the perfect number? What's just right? And the answer is it's completely and totally arbitrary. We did 25 hours of Lost in the first season and 17 in the final season, and the experience of making those seasons of television was based on, we'll be able to keep the quality bar high with the less episodes that we make. And then as we went into leftovers, we did 10, 10, and 8. And people were like, why aren't you doing 10 episodes in the final season? And I was like, because 8 felt like the right number. A story has to always be in service, I think, to the characters and the themes. Otherwise, you're just sort of like doling out plot. You can't structure it in a linear fashion. You can't sit around the table and say, what are the themes of Watchmen? What shall we be pursuing? You start to talk about some of the themes or ideas that you want to discuss. In the case of Watchmen, we were inheriting themes from the masterpiece that was written in the mid-'80s by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. The idea of the law and what's the line between a vigilante and a hero? How do we build upon those ideas? What was relevant in the mid-1980s may not be as relevant in 2019, but some things are evergreen. And one of the things that we really locked into, or I was really interested in when I first came into the writer's room, was the idea of masks. A mask simultaneously conceals and reveals. That seemed really interesting to us, particularly as it came into the idea of superheroes. And when they chose their superhero identity, there seemed to be some sort of causal relationship with trauma. And once we sort of had those themes going, when we started to actually talk about story, we needed to do an origin story for a character named Hooded Justice, who had a noose around his neck and a dark hood that was designed very similarly to that of the Klan. One of our writers, Cord Jefferson, said, I think that this guy, he was a cop in the 1930s in New York. He says, I think some of his fellow police officers tried to lynch this guy to scare him. And they cut him down, and the noose was still around his neck when he was sort of wandering home in a stupor, and he broke up this attempted sexual assault. And it was misinterpreted as some sort of act of valiant courage. But in fact, he was just working out the trauma of this thing that had just been done to him. And so that's a moment where the story completely and totally locks into theme. And then that idea, that origin story that Cord pitched, started to kind of connect to these other ideas that we were throwing around in the writer's room, and it kind of became our true north. There is this idea, it is a maxim that we should all apply to and as I began to express my emotional experience with learning about Tulsa to people of color who were sort of like, yeah, I've known about this my entire life. That was my way of saying, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I want to talk about this. Can we talk about this? And for those who said, absolutely, you can do this, I did not hire those individuals. The ones who said, this is going to be problematic, but it is interesting, I hired, because you have to go into it with a high degree of not cynicism, but you have to respect the degree of difficulty, and you have to know when to get out of your own way. And for someone who, it's immensely difficult for me to let go. I really need to control things, particularly creatively. I went into the process of Watchmen saying, I'm going to listen. And on the second day that we were all working together, I started talking, and everybody was looking at me like I was an idiot. And I was like, this is the room that I wanted. And I just stopped talking and I started listening, and it was not easy. It was infuriating and frustrating. But once I moved through that period of admitting to myself that there were others in the room who were more qualified and better at telling this story than I was, the show was able to happen, not because of me, but in spite of me.